Hello everyone, welcome to the Creepytime Ghost Story channel, which brings you real horror stories broadcast at 6 p.m. every day. After a period of surveying and realizing that people seem to be interested in the genre of rules, from now on I will bring to everyone the real legal stories that I have collected over the past time. Tonight we step aboard something far more unsettling than your average commuter ride, the last train bound for Aokigahara forest. The fluorescent lights inside hum with a tired, uneven rhythm, casting shadows that sway with each subtle turn of the wheels. Outside, the night has swallowed everything but the faint reflection of the carriage in the glass. It's a kind of darkness that feels like it's pressing in, watching. And in the middle of it all sits Michael, a man who has no idea just how thin the line is between making it to his destination and never arriving anywhere again. You probably won't survive this. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, turn down the lights, turn on the fan for some soothing background music, and let's go on our journey tonight. The digital clock above the doors blinks 11:58 p.m. as Michael steps on board. The platform is empty. No station master, no late night stragglers, just the quiet hiss of the doors closing behind him. The train shudders, then begins to pull away from the station like it's in no hurry to arrive anywhere important. Michael chooses a seat halfway down the carriage habit more than thought. Years ago, he read a travel tip online about how the middle of a train car was statistically safest in case of derailment. Of course, that was about city trains, not ones that pass through Japan's most infamous forest. The air smells faintly metallic, as if the train's heating system has been dormant for too long. He looks around. 4 other passengers, one man in a navy suit asleep against the window, a young couple whispering in Japanese, and an older woman sitting so still she could be carved from stone. A faint announcement crackles in Japanese, then English. Last departure, destination, Kawaguchiko, non-stop through restricted section. Michael frowns. Restricted section wasn't on the route map when he bought the ticket. A piece of history floats to mind something he'd once read in a travel magazine. Back in 1967, a freight train derailed on this same line when the driver swore he saw a figure standing on the tracks. No body was ever found, but the wreckage blocked the forest route for days. Since then, locals have whispered about the extra passenger who boards trains at night, never seen during the day. The train hums into the countryside, the windows revealing little more than shadowy shapes of trees. Michael's phone signal flickers, then dies. He tries not to think about the fact that Aokigahara is known for its complete dead zones. Something shifts in the far corner of the carriage, a faint rustle. He turns, but the old woman is still in the same rigid position, her face just barely catching the light. Her eyes seem to be fixed on him, though it could be a trick of the shadows. Michael remembers the warning a hostel owner in Tokyo had given him earlier that day. If you must take the last train, follow the rules. Don't think they're just stories. At the time, it had sounded like tourist bait, one of those urban legend pitches meant to sell more ghost tours. Now, in the stale air of the carriage, it feels less like a joke and more like an unspoken agreement between those who know and those who don't. The train makes a long, slow curve. Beyond the glass, a flicker of pale light appears between the trees, moving at the same speed as the train. For a moment, Michael thinks it's another carriage reflected in the window, but there's nothing else on the track. Do ghosts really exist? Or are they just the brain's way of making sense of the unexplained? Is a question Michael never cared about before tonight. Yet as the flicker draws closer, forming something vaguely human in shape, the answer starts to matter. A memory rises. Uninvited, a news story from 2 winters ago about a university student who boarded this train at exactly midnight. Security footage showed him in the last carriage. He never got off. The flicker vanishes, swallowed by the blackness outside. Michael's eyes dart to the train map above the door. Only 3 more stops before Aokigahara. The rules, whatever they are, have already begun to tighten around him. And somewhere in the metal belly of this last train, something is watching for the first misstep. The first rule, Michael remembers, was the one the hostel owner had emphasized with a sudden seriousness. Never sit in the last carriage. At the time, it had seemed absurd. The whole point of trains was that every carriage was more or less the same. But now, as the wheels clattered over a stretch of track older than his parents, Michael found himself glancing down the narrow passage toward the back of the train. The door at the far end swayed slightly with the movement, and beyond it, through the small window, there was nothing but black. No hint of light, no sign of passengers. Michael shifted in his seat, an uneasy heat crawling across his neck. It was then that he noticed something strange. The man in the navy suit, the one who had been asleep earlier, was now gone. No rustle of fabric, no sound of footsteps, just an empty seat where he had been. Michael frowned. He would have seen him walk past. The old woman hadn't moved, but now her head was slightly tilted, eyes fixed not on Michael, but on the door leading to the last carriage. She didn't blink. A story from decades past returned to him unbidden. In 1982, a train conductor making the same route had reported a lone passenger sitting in the last carriage, an elderly man in a white scarf. When the conductor tried to check his ticket, the man simply vanished. Railway officials brushed it off as fatigue, but the conductor resigned a week later, insisting that whatever he saw was not of this world. Michael's attention snapped back to the present as the young couple across from him suddenly stood up. They murmured to each other in low, urgent Japanese, glancing toward the back of the train. The woman gripped her partner's arm, her face pale. Without a word to anyone else, they moved 2 carriages forward, leaving their seats behind. The space felt larger now, emptier, and somehow colder. From somewhere down the corridor, a sound rose, not footsteps, more like the slow drag of something heavy across the floor. Michael's breathing shallowed. He thought about the extra passenger legend from 1967, the one who boarded between stations and never seemed to have a destination. If that thing existed, where else would it ride but in the empty dark of the last carriage? The train plunged into a tunnel, the lights inside dimming just enough to make the shadows deepen. When they emerged, Michael's eyes were drawn again to the glass of the rear door. At first, he thought it was just his own reflection, distorted by the motion. But the silhouette didn't match his shape. It was taller, broader, standing perfectly still. The carriage jolted as if hitting a rough patch of track. Michael blinked and the shape was gone. Do ghosts really exist, he wondered, or is this all just the tricks of a tired mind? The air in the carriage was growing stale. He decided to follow the couple's lead, but the moment he stood, the old woman finally moved. Her head turned slowly toward him, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Stay where you are." Her Japanese was soft but unmistakable. Michael didn't speak much, but the words landed clearly enough. Her gaze cut briefly to the last carriage door before returning to him. Then she closed her eyes again, as if she hadn't spoken at all. He hesitated, sitting back down. That's when the sound came again, the dragging, closer now. He swore it was coming from just beyond that swing door. A true story surfaced from his memory. A hiker in 2004 had boarded the train at Fuji Station, planning to get off just before Aokigahara to start a solo trek. She was last seen walking toward the forest, from a small unmanned platform. Weeks later, her backpack was found in an abandoned rail siding, miles away from any trail. The siding could only be reached by passing through the last carriage and exiting from its rear. Michael's stomach tightened. He gripped the armrest. The rules weren't just silly warnings, they were breadcrumbs left by survivors, or maybe by those who didn't survive but still wanted to warn others. The dragging sound stopped. Silence fell so completely he could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Then, from behind the door to the last carriage, came 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Michael stayed frozen, every instinct screaming not to look. Michael told himself not to turn around. The first knock had been bad enough sharp, like a fist against metal, but the second and third had a weight to them, as if whatever was on the other side wasn't knocking to come in. It was knocking to be let in. The old woman's eyes were open again, but this time they weren't on the door, they were on Michael, unblinking, like she was silently daring him to break the second rule. Rule 2. Avoid eye contact with fellow passengers. It sounded so harmless when he first heard it. But then the hostel owner had explained the belief that passengers on the last train weren't always human. If you looked them in the eye, you might realize what they were too late, and by then, they'd know you knew. Michael swallowed, looking down at the floor. He focused on the patterned carpet, ignoring the urge to glance up at her. But in the reflection on the window beside him, he could see her faint outline, and she was smiling. His pulse quickened. He shifted his gaze to the window across the aisle, trying to focus on the blur of trees outside. Somewhere in the movement, another reflection joined his own, a pale face, impossibly close, framed by a hooded white coat. The woman was no longer seated where she had been. She was now 2 rows away from him, standing in the aisle, her head tilted at the same angle as before. He hadn't seen her move. A flicker of real history cut through his panic. In the winter of 1978, a salaryman named Hiroshi boarded the midnight train from Tokyo to Yamanashi. Witnesses reported he sat opposite a woman in a white coat who stared at him the entire trip. When the train stopped, Hiroshi was gone, but the woman was seen stepping off alone. His body was never found, though his briefcase turned up months later in a part of Aokigahara far from any trail. Michael blinked, and she was sitting again in the exact same posture as before, hands folded neatly in her lap. Do ghosts really exist? He wondered, or does the brain just fill in the gaps? A true account from a friend surfaced, someone who had visited Japan years ago. She'd taken the last train too, and swore she'd shared her carriage with a middle-aged man who didn't blink for the entire 40-minute ride. She remembered nothing else of the journey except the way her hands had ached afterward, like she'd been gripping the seat to keep from sliding toward him. The train slowed unexpectedly. Through the windows, Michael could see only thick trees. There was no platform, no lights, just the dense darkness of the forest. The announcement system hissed and clicked, but no words followed. In that silence, he realized he was holding his breath. The old woman finally looked away, turning her head toward the forest. The young couple 2 cars ahead were peering through the connecting doors, their faces pale. Michael's gaze shifted back to the window. The woman in the white coat was gone again. A movement caught his eye outside this time, just beyond the glass. Among the trees, a figure stood in the snow, tall, still, and facing the train. Its head moved slowly, tracking the carriage as it rolled past. The train began to move faster, but the figure didn't fade into the distance. It stayed alongside, gliding effortlessly through the forest, as if matching the train's speed. Michael felt the urge to look at the old woman again, to see if she noticed. But the rule was clear. Avoid eye contact with fellow passengers. If she wasn't entirely human, if she was something else, riding this train with him, acknowledging her might be an invitation. The carriage lights flickered once. When they steadied, she was back in her seat, her lips curved into that same knowing smile. And Michael understood. If he broke the second rule, he wouldn't need to worry about reaching Aokigahara. He might never reach any station again. The train was supposed to pass through without stopping. Until the next small station, Michael knew that much. But when the brakes hissed and the carriage slowed to a crawl, his stomach tightened. There was no reason to stop here. Through the grimy windows, the forest pressed in close, the branches curling toward the glass like fingers, and then Michael saw it. An unmarked platform, old and cracked, barely wide enough for a few people to stand. No lights, no shelter, just a platform and the forest beyond it. The door slid open with a metallic sigh. No one moved. The announcement system crackled again, but instead of words, a faint sound filtered through something like a radio tuned between stations. Beneath the static, Michael thought he heard a low, distorted voice speaking Japanese. The young couple from 2 cars ahead appeared in the doorway between carriages, peering toward the platform but not stepping out. Their eyes met his for a fraction of a second before they turned and retreated back into the train. A flicker of history rose in Michael's mind. During World War II, some rural train lines were used to transport injured soldiers away from the coast. One story claimed a wounded lieutenant was left behind at a forgotten platform like this when the train was forced to evacuate quickly during an air raid. Locals said that afterward, the platform would appear only at night, and sometimes only to those who were meant to see it. Michael stared at the dark opening between the trees. He thought he saw movement in there, something pale shifting among the shadows. Do ghosts really exist, or does fear just make you find meaning where there's none? He tried to convince himself it was the wind. Then he remembered a true case from just last year. A woman in her 20s boarded this same route late at night. Security footage showed her sitting alone in a carriage, scrolling on her phone. Somewhere after passing a known forest stretch, the train made an unlisted stop. She was never seen on any platform cameras afterward, but her phone was later found in the undergrowth less than 100 meters from Aokigahara's western edge. Michael's seat felt like it was tilting forward, urging him toward the open door. He could hear faint footsteps outside, now slow, deliberate, crunching softly against the platform's old wood. The old woman's voice cut through the sound. "Don't get up." Her tone was calm but firm, like she'd said this many times before. Michael's instincts agreed with her, but then the dragging sound returned, this time from inside the train, coming from the last carriage. It grew louder, closer, until it stopped just beyond the connecting door. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, as if curious. The pale movement among the trees resolved itself into shapes, figures, at least 3, maybe 4, standing still and facing the train. The lights above flickered, and for a split second, Michael saw the figures closer than they had any right to be, just beyond the doorway. The train jolted forward, the doors shut, the unmarked platform slid away into darkness, the figures vanishing with it. Michael leaned back, pulse racing, and realized something terrifying. The rules were working, and that meant the rules were real. The train picked up speed, the rattling of the wheels like a nervous heartbeat. Michael tried to calm his breathing, but his pulse still raced. He hadn't moved since the unmarked platform faded into the dark. He told himself that whatever had been standing out there was gone now. But then, Michael. The voice was soft, female, and far too familiar. His head snapped toward the sound. No one in the carriage had spoken, but the voice had come from his right, from outside, beyond the glass. Rule 3. Don't answer voices calling your name. The hostel owner's warning came back to him. Sometimes they'll sound like people you love. Sometimes they'll sound like you. Michael's throat went dry. The voice called again, a little louder this time. Michael, it's me. It was his sister's voice, Anna. He gripped the edge of his seat. Anna had been gone for 3 years. No one had found her body after the climbing accident in Montana, but there had been enough evidence to know she hadn't survived. And yet, here was her voice, lilting through the dark like she was leaning in just outside the window. He kept his eyes fixed forward. Outside, the black trees blurred by in streaks, but he thought he saw movement keeping pace with the train, something pale weaving between the trunks. Do ghosts really exist, or is grief just a trickster that finds ways to speak to us? He remembered an article he'd read years ago about Aokigahara. In 1999, a man claimed he heard his dead wife's voice calling to him from the forest as he hiked near the train line. He followed the sound off the path. His friends found his body 2 days later, less than a mile from the tracks. The voice came again, this time almost pleading. Michael, please, I need your help. The old woman across from him was watching him carefully. Slowly, she shook her head. His fingers dug into the armrest. Every instinct screamed to look, to check if maybe impossibly it really was Anna. But the rule was clear. Answering meant giving permission. And in Aokigahara, permission meant invitation. The train lurched suddenly, as if hitting a patch of bad track. The lights above flickered, and in that strobe-like moment, Michael saw her Anna standing outside the glass. She looked exactly as she had the summer before she died, down to the little silver necklace she never took off. Her lips moved in slow motion. Help me. He turned away so sharply it hurt his neck. He didn't speak. A true story he'd once heard from a friend in Kyoto rose unbidden. A man took this very train late at night and swore he saw his childhood dog running alongside the carriage, barking happily. He tapped on the window, calling his name. Minutes later, he vanished from his seat while the train was still moving. Michael didn't know what happened to those who answered, and he wasn't about to find out. The voice stopped. Outside, the forest slipped farther from the train as the track veered away. The glass reflected only his own pale face now. He leaned back, trying to steady his breathing, and thought about what the hostel owner had said. It's not about whether you believe the rules. It's about whether they believe you'll follow them. Tonight, the rules believed Michael was still playing along. The rhythm of the train had almost lulled Michael into thinking the worst had passed until the first flicker came. It was subtle at first, just a momentary dimming of the overhead lights, like the train had dipped into a pocket of weak power. But then it happened again. Rule 4. If the lights flicker, close your eyes. The hostel owner's voice echoed in his mind, sharp this time. Don't look when the dark comes, it's not meant for you. Michael's hands tightened on the armrest. The lights went out completely for a second, plunging the carriage into pitch black. He shut his eyes. Immediately, his other senses heightened the metallic tang in the air, the faint scent of damp soil, the way the sound of the train wheels seemed farther away now, almost muted. Somewhere in that darkness, something moved. It was a slow, deliberate shift, like cloth sliding against the aisle floor. He could feel it more than hear it, like a presence brushing against the edges of his awareness. His mind flashed to the story of the 1950 derailment. A passenger train had gone off the tracks on a sharp curve near the edge of Aokigahara. 17 people were killed, and several bodies were never recovered from the wreckage. Locals said the forest had taken them, which was why even now railway workers avoided walking that section at night. Michael's breathing grew shallow. Something was near his seat now. Do ghosts really exist? Or is darkness just a canvas for the brain's worst inventions? The air shifted, cold, close, and then a whisper so faint he almost missed it. Open them. Every muscle in his body wanted to obey, to find out what was there. But the rule was simple, and it was survival. He kept his eyes shut tight. A true account returned to him, one he'd read on a Japanese blog. A woman riding the last train home fell asleep, only to wake in darkness. She opened her eyes during a flicker and saw dozens of pale hands reaching from the floor toward her. When the lights came back, she was alone. She never rode the night train again. The air grew colder still. Michael could sense it moving past him now, slow and deliberate, like it was testing him. The carriage seemed to lean with its weight. The flickering grew rapid, like a dying fluorescent bulb. Each burst of darkness seemed to last longer than the light. And then silence. The hum of the train returned in full, the wheels clattering normally again. Michael risked opening his eyes. The lights were steady. The carriage was empty except for the old woman, who now sat facing forward as if nothing had happened. Only one thing had changed. The seat in front of him, which had been empty since he boarded, now had a long wet streak running across it, like something had slid over the fabric and kept moving. The lights stayed steady now, but the air felt heavier, thicker, almost humid. Outside the window, the forest had crept closer. The trees were gnarled and bent, their branches twisted like ribs pressing inward. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the blur of trunks as the train wound deeper into Aokigahara's edge. Somewhere in that darkness, he thought he saw flashes of red-dyed cloth fluttering from branches. He read about those before, trail markers left by hikers so they could find their way back. Some of them were still there because their owners had never returned. The hostel owner had mentioned one more thing, something less of a rule and more of a warning. The closer you get to the forest, the less the train belongs to you. Michael remembered a historical account from 1933, when the train line was still new. A group of survivalists had taken the train into the region to prepare for a winter expedition. Only one returned. He kept a journal of their journey into Aokigahara. But the final page ended mid-sentence. The forest doesn't. Nothing more. The journal had been found inside the last carriage of a train, the ink still damp. Do ghosts really exist? Or is the human mind simply drawn to unsolved endings? Michael shifted in his seat as a low vibration passed through the floor. It wasn't the steady rumble of the wheels, it was slower, more like something moving underneath. The old woman's hands were folded in her lap now, her knuckles pale. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring straight ahead, as though focusing on something just beyond the next bend. The trees outside grew denser. Between them, shapes emerged pale. Still figures standing shoulder to shoulder in the gaps. The train speed didn't seem to matter. They remained in view as if the forest was keeping pace. Michael remembered a true story from a foreign blogger who had visited Japan. He'd taken this route out of curiosity, planning to photograph the forest from the train. In his final blog post, he wrote about seeing too many people for a place with no trails. The post ended with, "They're still watching me now." It was uploaded at 12:14 a.m. No posts after that. Michael's skin prickled as the shapes between the trees began to blur, melting into the dark, only to appear again closer, always closer. A soft hum drifted through the air. It didn't come from the train. It was outside, vibrating in the trees, almost like a low chant or the drone of insects. It swelled, dipped, and then swelled again until Michael could feel it pressing against his chest. The young couple from earlier reappeared briefly. their faces pale in the glow from the connecting carriage. They didn't speak. They just glanced toward the windows, then hurried forward again. The forest pressed right against the tracks now. The twisted branches scraped faintly along the carriage sides. Michael could swear the wood wasn't just wood anymore. It looked like fingers reaching to hook the windows. The old woman finally moved, just slightly, leaning toward him. "We're almost there," she murmured. Michael didn't know if she meant the station or something else entirely. The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes echoing in the enclosed night. Michael's stomach tightened. This was it, the final stop. Rule 5. Leave before the final stop. The hostel owner's last warning came back to him, spoken in a tone that was less about fear and more about inevitability. If you stay to the end, the forest will take you. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but it will have you. Michael glanced toward the nearest exit. The young couple was already moving down the aisle, their pace quick, almost desperate. The old woman remained seated, watching him with that same quiet intensity. The PA system crackled, but no announcement followed, only a low, distorted hum, like the sound of breath over a microphone. Outside, the forest was no longer a blur of trees. It was a wall of black, unbroken, and complete. Do ghosts really exist, or are they just the forest's way of giving itself a face? Michael's eyes flicked to the window. In the reflection, something stood directly behind him, tall, broad-shouldered, its head bent just enough to fit in the carriage. He didn't turn. The brakes sighed again. The train was still moving, but slower now. The next station wasn't visible yet, but he knew it was close. His pulse pounded in his ears. He thought about the man from the hostel owner story, the one who ignored the rules, stayed to the final stop, and was found days later, deep in the forest, sitting upright against a tree with his eyes open and his hands folded neatly in his lap. A true account drifted in from memory. In 2015, a rail worker doing a pre-dawn inspection found an entire last carriage empty except for a single briefcase. Inside was a train ticket to Kawaguchiko, stamped for the previous night. The seat it was assigned to was still warm. Michael's instincts screamed at him to move, but his legs felt locked. The old woman finally stood. Without looking away from him, she nodded toward the connecting door. Now, he pushed himself up, stumbling into the aisle as the train began to round a slow curve. Through the window ahead, a small, dimly lit platform came into view, unlisted on any map, but real enough in this moment. The young couple stepped off without hesitation. Michael followed, the cold night air biting instantly at his skin. Behind him, the train's doors shut with a final hiss. Through the glass, the old woman remained inside, her face unreadable. As the train pulled away, he saw the last carriage's interior darken, the reflection of something tall, standing where he'd been moments before. The taillights vanished into the forest. Silence closed in. Michael stood on the platform with the young couple, all three breathing hard, the only sound the faint wind in the trees. He realized the rules weren't about superstition, they were a map. Not of the train line, but of the boundary between the world that belongs to the living and the one that doesn't. Wind down? 300 words? The cold seeped into Michael's bones, but it felt cleaner than the air inside the train. The forest loomed only meters away, yet it no longer seemed to press against him. The young couple kept their eyes down, whispering softly in Japanese. Somewhere far off, the faint hum of the rails faded until there was nothing left but the sound of night. He thought of each rule, their simplicity, their precision, and understood that they weren't warnings as much as they were bargains. You follow them, you get to walk away. You ignore them, you become part of the story. The dim platform light flickered once, briefly painting the forest in pale yellow. Michael thought he saw movement among the trees, but when the light steadied, the space was empty, or empty enough to believe. His breath came slow now. The young couple started walking toward the narrow gravel path that would lead to a road, and Michael followed, each step pulling him farther from the place where rules and reality blurred. Behind him, the track stretched into the dark, waiting for the next train, waiting for the next passenger who would think the rules were just stories. Somewhere far off, a whistle blew soft, almost apologetic. Michael didn't look back, because once you've been on the last train through Aokigahara, you learn that some journeys are meant to be escaped, not completed.